So before I get to the next Q&A, because I just can't make it work, which will be related to the injury thing I talked about last time, I'm going to do another intervening video that I want to address a throwaway statement I've made in the previous two videos, having to do with training, having to do with injuries, that has to do with when training is being personally coached versus when it's being uncoached, and what implications that has that are forgotten by most in this field when they are giving recommendations or writing down training or giving these ideas. And that includes mind, but when I talk about my own stuff, I'm going to point out that I'm actually very careful because I recognize that there are humongous differences in what recommendations I can give someone who's going to be training on their own versus what I can tell them or what I can do with them if I'm coaching them personally, or, for example, when I do a consultation with them. Available now, bodyrecomposition.com. First, the inevitable correction to last week. So before going to the main thrust of the video, I want to make a correction to what I said about Strongman last week, because of course I fucked it up. As it turned out, the day after I put out my video, I was at a Big Tex gym here in Austin, taking my powerlifter through her final meet prep, and ended up talking to a guy who came from powerlifting and now does strongman competition. And he made me aware that in most cases, competitors are given at least the general idea of what the events will be 3 months out. It wasn't like right beforehand, like I said, because I didn't know what the fuck I was talking about. And I probably should have checked, but oh well, that's why we do corrections. And so yeah, so he's like, you know, it gives the athletes time to adjust their training towards those events. Like they're still training, I get the impression, in a very all-around fashion most of the time. But with the 5 events, or 10 in the case of the bigger events, they can adjust their training accordingly. One thing I did learn that I wasn't aware of was that apparently, like, Strongman has very little of a rule book. It's not super formalized like powerlifting, by which I mean that, like, the promoters and the organizers can pretty much pick whatever fucking events they want and kind of do them how they want. The only rules, he said, on the overhead, there's a Viking press, which is like an overhead press. You can't double dip, you can't jerk it, you can overhead press it and push press it. And there's one other one that I have now forgotten because I'm old, my memory is failing. But regardless, it's like, yeah, if they want to do an event a certain way with a certain bar, a certain piece of equipment, that's what the athletes do, which is why he said he switched from powerlifting. Because, again, powerlifting, love it as a sport, love training athletes, love the community. It's boring as fuck to watch. Yay. Olympic lifting is the same way for me. I'm sure there are some that can appreciate the beauty and dynamism of the sport, but to me it's just a bunch of guys doing the same shit with another kilo on the bar. So strongman, at least the competitions are interesting because it's 5 different events, and they'll change event to event, which makes it more interesting for the spectators and more interesting for the athletes. Which is arguably a big part of why this, like ESPN and sports shows will show World's Strongest Man and won't show powerlifting and Olympic lifting by and large. Because they know what people want to watch. And it's not a bunch of guys squatting with 5 pounds heavier than the last dude. Again, I'm not criticizing powerlifting. I fucking love it as a sport. I find most sports boring to watch. But powerlifting and Olympic lifting especially, if you go see a meet and you don't know someone who's competing, take a book. Yes, Strongman is at least has some variety and interesting, comparatively speaking. Not criticizing the sports of powerlifting, Olympic lifting. Do not mishear me. Making a statement of fact about spectating the goddamn things. All right. So again, that's my correction. I fucked it up. Not shocking. Wanted to make sure I corrected that, so let's get to it. So as always, a couple definitions. So what exactly do I mean by coached versus uncoached training? Well, just for the purpose of this video, I'm going to use it in 2 different ways. The literal sense, and also more of a figurative sense. In the literal sense, I mean actually having a personal coach there watching your training, overseeing it on a regular basis. I should probably write scripts, but that ain't never going to happen. So, for example, when I was incarcerated in Salt Lake City and ice speed skating, my coach was at the ice. And some of our other workouts, they're called dry land, every day. Well, except when he made himself sick by catering to the people that never showed up, but that's a whole separate thing. So that on every day, he may have had a plan, but he was adjusting it based on what he was seeing, giving us technical feedback. The grand majority of time when I coached my elite powerlifter, I was in the gym with her every day, 6 days a week for the 8 years that I coached her. Yeah, that's not true. The first year, she did more of her workouts on her own, but once we got beyond that point, every day, every single day, and I'll talk more about that later. So that's what I mean by coached. Uncoached means you don't have a coach there. You're overseeing your own training. And that is the case regardless of your background, whether you're a general trainee, even if you're a trainer or a coach yourself, right? I didn't have anyone overseeing me when I was in the weight room other than me, which is its own set of problems. And many coaches, my elite powerlifter is a trainer herself. I still coached her every day. So that's what I mean by coach versus uncoached, literally. Now, in more of a figurative sense, what I'm talking about has to do with like books, articles, the dumb shit recommendations that the majority of the fitness industry is giving on a second-by-second basis of what you should never do or should do, or volumes or intensities or any of this other dumb fucking shit, right? They're just throwing these recommendations out based on whatever their bias is, whatever brand new paper, whatever they fucking have to sell. There is no nuance. There is no context. It's just do 32 sets a week, because I'm too stupid to know that that's not really what the paper found or suggests or what the researchers even said. Or 52 sets per week, right, Milo? Right? When I write my books, I have to give advice in a certain way because I'm not there. I don't know who the person is reading it. I don't know the context. That's uncoached in a figurative sense. Whereas, say, when I do consultations with people, available now, bodyrecomposition.com, I am able to determine their needs on a much more individual basis. Right? So that makes sense. The literal meaning, coached, you've got a coach there overseeing your training on at least a semi-regular basis. Uncoached, you're handling your own training. Even if it's based on someone else's workout that they gave you, a template or whatever. In more of a figurative sense, coached will mean that you consulted with the person, you were given some sort of individualized approach based on a needs analysis. Versus uncoached means you were given some generic fucking advice in a book, including one of my own. And again, I'll talk about that later. So, before I really talk about issues, I just want to give some examples of some, well, I'm going to sort of compare and contrast within some real world examples that already exist and why what can be done in a coached context frequently not only cannot be done in a coached context, but more importantly, shouldn't be done in an uncoached context. Let's start with an easy one, Westside barbell training under Louis Simmons, again, RIP, passed away a year or two ago. So during its heyday, which was many years ago, it sort of dominated powerlifting for 10, 20 years. Louis wrote a lot of articles. I mean, they were all the same. If you'd read one, you'd pretty much read them all. Although if you track the history from the beginning, you can see how his approach evolved over the years of applying it. And people online would frequently go, yeah, I trained Westside, because they were following the template in his article, or he did write a book eventually that's just the same article repeated about 32 times. But Dave Tate and Jim Wendler, when they were there before they started Elite Fitness, and many others would point out, if you're not at Westside Barbell, by which they mean at Louis' gym in Columbus, you're not training Westside. You may be following a Westside template. You may be training Westside-ish, but you're not training Westside because you're not there with Louis. Louis was coaching every day those athletes, modifying the training, presumably based on his years, decades of experience, based on what he was seeing, based on his ideas, some of which panned out, some of which were crazy as fuck, and some of which were genuinely, in my opinion, dumb as shit. Regardless, any article you were reading of his really represented whatever they were doing whenever he submitted that article. What they were doing at Westside then, on any given day, on any given week, on any given month, was probably different than that. And even though they had a fairly rigid template in a lot of ways, in terms of the way it was set up and structured, the ME days and the DE days and which days fell on which, I can guarantee you that Louis was using his extremely well-trained eye to make changes as needed based on what he was seeing, because that's what coaching is. And that is vastly different than the people who were doing it on their own based on their understanding or frequently misunderstanding of it. And I'm not criticizing Louis, right? When you write articles, again, I'll come back to this at the end, you can only do what you can do, which is to put the information. But that information will be much less contextualized, much less detailed than, I guarantee, what the lifters were getting under Louis himself. I guess on the topic of strength training, I should mention Starting Strength from Mark Ripito up north of me here in Texas, which really sort of hit its stride in the 2000s, and it's pretty much died off now. Although I keep meaning we've got a Starting Strength gym franchise here in Austin. I should go let them take me through a workout. Regardless, you saw some problems there, in as much as, you know, the Starting Strength technique on everything was kind of trash to begin with. Nipples at the floor on squats, fuck me. You know, the big thing was, oh, if you're a beginner, just add, 5 pounds a week. And then you'd see people online who weren't training with Mark up at Starting Strength Compound or whatever the hell it is. And it was even more tragic than, again, the technique that he was naturally teaching, because they would just add weight and add weight and add weight and add weight whether they were ready or not, because that's what Mark said to do, add 5 pounds a workout or week or whatever the fuck it was. And without having someone there to hold them back, presumably Mark or one of the people there, they got themselves into trouble. So it's a real easy example of when you give that simplistic advice with no sort of context to add weight at every workout, without being there as a coach to oversee the advice that you would modify, assuming you have a fucking brain, people get into trouble. And that's exactly what happened. Because Starting Strength book taken to its logical extreme, it's probably not what Rip was doing in person. I'm guessing. And the proof was in the pudding. The people who just added weight and added weight and added weight had even shittier technique than Rip taught to begin with. Example that comes to mind is Charlie Francis. He was the track coach, trained Ben Johnson and many other top sprinters. And I actually had the opportunity, thankfully, to meet him shortly before he passed. He had a seminar up in Utah that I took my own coach to. And he wrote a couple books. He had Speed Trap, which is more the story of Ben and his career. But he also had the Charlie Francis training system, where he laid out the different components of his training and how he applied it. He also, with Derek Hansen, a guy who worked with him. I mean, Charlie's one of those guys, he was so brilliant that he couldn't actually explain his system very well because it was so intuitive to him, and that is common with many coaches and many athletes. What they're doing is so automatic that they actually are not good at explaining it, and Derek helped him translate that into English for those of us who couldn't, read his mind. But you could take his training system and the slides from the seminars that they did where he laid out what he did, and you would be following a Charlie Francis template. But in many ways, probably that information could go very, very, very wrong. Because he wrote in Speed Trap especially, as his athletes got more advanced, that on any given day, what he did with them could be very flexible based on what he was seeing, based on what they looked like in warm-ups. Where if they looked fried, even if they had a sprint day scheduled, if they looked like shit and he knew they couldn't make their numbers, he would change the training. Whether it was running him into the wind so they couldn't compare times because they would get really in their head about not running their best all the time, or giving them a light day, what he would do in the weight room depending on what happened during the sprint workout itself. He talked about how even if he had X number of repeats planned, if he heard or saw the athlete's technique changing, a little bit heavier, a little bit slower off the ground, because he was so quality oriented, he would stop the workout, even if it was only 3 of 6 planned repeat. Because it's interesting, he did mention that he'd seen that many of his female athletes tended to treat the workout plan as holy writ, and that he started throwing them up, tore them up. Because if he told the athlete, well, we've got 6 repeats planned, but stop if things start to get bad, they would always do 6, and then they would get injured because he wasn't there to stop them in that case. And following the written workout as written got them into trouble because they didn't have the ability to adjust, which really kind of makes my point. It's very difficult to put that in a book, in an article, even in a presentation. That coaching represented his his decade as a sprinter himself and his 2 decades or more as a coach. These were things that he had learned. He couldn't readily put that into writing such that anyone could simply take that program and try to reproduce it with the same effects. So what he was doing as a coach on a day-to-day basis, based on what he saw, and what went into the book, could only be so similar. Moving on. And moving to some Olympic lifting examples, I guess one really good one that since I was supposed to be mentioning injuries would be the Russian stuff. And in the 70s, as the Russians started to really come to the forefront, start to dominate a handful of Olympic events, which people forget. The Germans dominated even less and for a much shorter period of time. Russian sports secrets became a huge thing. Again, I got a zillion books. I've got all the Russian translations. I've got all that shit on my shelf. I've read it all, such as it was. And American coaches, despite the fact that they'd been dominating the fucking Olympics for decades, were like, well, the Russians are starting to beat our athletes because they were full-time athletes who were all on drugs, and that was why. And the Russians were sending hundreds of thousands of athletes into a grinder system. But they figured, the Russian sports secrets, and they would get these Russian books, and they would try to apply that stuff uncritically. And with these giant 5-year plans and these massive volumes and intensities. But where people really got fucked was with plyometrics, a.k.a. shock training, a.k.a. Yuri Verkhoshansky, which was jump training. I mean, Jesus Christ, Lyle, it was plyometrics. It was basically rebound training. Now, when the Russians were much more specific about this. Shock training specifically was box jumps and depth jumps, where you would start on a high box and jump and rebound. But what got left out and misunderstood by the dumb fuck Americans was that there was a whole ton of different plyometric exercises, ranging from ankle hops and bounding to long jumps and vertical jumps and depth drops and depth jumps and all this other shit. And what wasn't understood or wasn't written about was that, okay, these Russian athletes are being built up into this over years. They're doing very low volumes. They're using them at occasional times of the year. But this wasn't being contextualized in these shitty Russian translations or in what little information was coming out. And there's also, it's been argued that the Russians deliberately released misinformation to try to fuck up other countries who they knew were going to follow their secrets. And you might interestingly note that in the 50s and 60s, the Russians studied arm lifters. One of my favorite stories. Before Paul Anderson started handing the Russians their ass on the Olympic lifting platform, the Russians didn't squat. When he came and destroyed their lifters, they said, what's your secret? He said, I squat all the time. And that's when the Russians started squatting all the time because of an American lifter. But that had flip-flopped. So you had all these coaches that were reading the Russian manuals or what they thought was Russian information, and either through ignorance or misunderstanding or because the information was just like snippets of it, throwing their athletes into ridiculous stuff and ruining them. So you'd hear about athletes being thrown into 1-meter depth jumps with no preparation for it. And they would blow out an ankle or blow out a knee. Charlie Francis talked about an American sprinter who was made to do one-legged box jumps by a coach that didn't know them and injured them shortly before the World Championships of the Olympics. So a lot of the Russian stuff, that was a problem. I mean, I mentioned Westside, and first off, even though Louis claimed to have read the Russian manuals and developed Westside, how he got to that system from what's in the shitty translations, beyond me. The Russians certainly didn't max all the time. They barely maxed, actually. Well, Russian Olympic lifters usually didn't max till the platform. So regardless, you had another place where it was being written by coaches frequently who were more theorists than actual coaches in the trench, was being misinterpreted by American coaches and who were using it without understanding it, without the contextualization of the drugs, the recovery, and the years of buildup, and blowing athletes up. So there's a really good example. The Russians got away. I mean, the Russians destroyed a lot of athletes too because they didn't care as much. They just wanted world champions. So, and they had hundreds of thousands of athletes to throw at it. Americans didn't, and by following this possibly deliberately misleading Russian propaganda, they blew up a lot of athletes. Coached versus reading about it without knowing what the fuck you're reading. Speaking of which, since I keep bringing them up, let's talk about the Bulgarians training under Abijayev. Because I think, on top of the fact that the program breaks most people under the best of conditions, on top of the fact that American athletes were trying to jump into it without the decade buildup or the support, they weren't being coached by Abijayev himself. Abijayev developed that system over many years, and where it started and where it ended were quite different. But if you see, Iron Mind did a training tape where he had a chance to video the Bulgarian team as they went into their final workouts before a major competition. And you can see that Abijayev is very heavily involved. Like, yeah, they were supposed to do their warm-ups and do X number of singles at max and do whatever. But when things are going wrong or going right, you can see him stepping in and either making technical changes or technical suggestions. Obviously, at that level, you're not changing technique, but why he was saying if a mislift occurred. There's a famous story that I would absolutely unable to find, where I think one of his lifters just kept missing a given weight and just wouldn't fucking quit. And Abijayev finally had to just go over there and tell him, stop. In that system, frequently after hitting a big max, they might drop back 5 or 10 kilos and do a lighter rep, and they might build back up. Right? So there was this system, and we can read about it. We can read what was written, usually by people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about. I've got a buddy who trained with Abijayev out in California before Abijayev passed several years ago and gave me a lot of insight into what was actually being done rather than what is people think was being done. Most of what was written about Bulgarian was people writing what they thought Bulgarian was, and it was just a giant game of telephone, where what people thought the system was is not really what was going on. But even if it was correct, at best it represented a snapshot image of what a platonic theoretical week, but what was going on a day-to-day basis in the training based on what Abijayev saw. Because you also read about how, yeah, maybe the goal was 6 singles, but he would have a lifter do 2, and because that was all he was good for, or would adjust the weights, or those technical changes. So what he did as a hands-on in the gym every day, knowing his lifter's coach, and what was or even could be written about it, were different enough, right? Because when you have 2 decades of experience, you can't put in writing what changes you're making on the day, at least not beyond a certain point, right? And I'll talk about this more when I talk about how I do things. So again, we've got this example that among the other problems with the Bulgarian system, which is why I need to fucking forget about it in its purest form, especially for powerlifting. Writing it down. Warm up and do 6 maximum singles every day because that's what they did. That's not what they did. That's not what Abijayev was actually doing in the gym with people, because he was making adjustments based on decades of experience. Moving on. One more Olympic lifting example, and that's the Chinese Olympic lifters, who are currently pretty much dominating the world, using a system that takes the best of the Russian system with hundreds of thousands of athletes and best of the German system, which throws them into a handful of sports and then just comes out and wrecks the world. But in as much as we know very much of what they're doing in Olympic lifting in the training hall, and we don't, and I don't claim to have expertise on this, I guarantee you that it's the same sort of situation. I have a buddy, Manuel Buitrago. I've known him for years, and I probably fucked up his last name, who works with Coach Ma, who is an ex-Chinese Olympic lifting coach. And they wrote a book about the Chinese system, which is good if you're interested in it, but if you're looking for a training manual, it ain't it. No criticism of Manuel, it is what it is. But what we've read about it, which is that, the Chinese Olympic lifters will do pretty much heavy snatch and clean and jerk most days in whatever pattern, and I don't know what those are, and then they'll do assistance work to fix weak points, and they do bodybuilding shit to build muscle mass. And as I noted and want to really drive home, they only squat heavy twice a week, and they all squat heavier than all of y'all put together, so knock this high-frequency shit off. What you hear about, and again, I've read blog posts by athletes that were in the system. Again, Manuel works with Coach Ma, so I know probably more about it than some, but again, I'm not claiming expertise. On top of the different levels of cycling, and they actually train the women slightly different than the men, and that's its own interesting set example, which I won't talk about here. It's a weak point training system. Like it's really well set up, and by which that I mean it's what I've been doing with my powerlifters since the late 90s. And what they do is they're doing heavy competition work very frequently, and the coach is, I'm sure, adjusting the numbers and the weights and the volumes on the fly. But one of the things that they're doing is they're looking for weak points. And so they'll identify a weak point, and then they'll throw a specific assistance movement at that for 2 weeks, and then they'll switch. It's similar to what Louis was doing with the ME work, but you have to realize that these coaches, are all like university trained by and large, but these have been trained in this system on top of having however many years of experience, and I'm sure only the top coaches get to work with the top athletes, to know, okay, I've seen this cause of a miss on the clean or the clean recovery or the snatch, whatever it is. And I've been taught and or learned through my experience that this is the assistance movement that I should program in a certain way to fix it. And as much as I like Manuel, as much as I like his book, you cannot put that in a book. Not really. Like you can go, okay, if you're having trouble with this, maybe try one of these 3 assistance movements. Like you can put it in a writing to a degree, but you cannot teach the coach's eye. You cannot teach what the coach is actually seeing on the day to make those choices in their coaching. You cannot write that down. You cannot express it beyond a certain level, which is the point I'm sort of trying to drive home in my own obsessive repetitive way. So having beaten that dead horse and hopefully made the point about the difference between being coached by a master coach and what can be written about and the differences and what can be applied, I'm going to use some of my own examples of what I've done over 30 years, where I supposedly have learned a few things in terms of how I approach coaching, what I might do differently in person versus not, and note that I do not do a lot of online coaching for reasons that I'll explain, on top of like what I put in my books versus what I might do in consults to really kind of drive this home. So without like trying to detail like what I do in terms of like powerlifting or coaching my athletes, which would be a whole separate video, which I might do, like as far as my overall approach, which is essentially what I've been doing with evolution since the 1990s, is first I believe in specificity and quality, which means doing the competition lifts properly, consistently, year-round. And the frequency varies depending on the lifter. Generally, the people I train no less than twice a week. And in Sumi's case, it's 3 times a week. I basically do almost essentially singles in the competition work. Sumi did some doubles in the bench just to get the reps. But number of reasons. 1, it maintains quality. And 2, I lose track. I lose count. 3 is about the limits of how high I can count before I lose track. So that's kind of why. And I mean, they're not max singles. They're heavy, 85, 90%. So they're not grinding. It's not Bulgarian powerlifting bullshit. Said it maintains high quality. Any powerlifter will tell you that heavier weights move differently, feel differently. Reps don't always transfer over. And I do think some of this is informed by the fact that I've worked almost exclusively with women. Men tend to be good at generating intensity, but shit at volume, and I think they often may benefit from higher volumes. And women tend to be great at volume and less so at intensity and have to learn better quality. Many of the reasons I just can't count over 1. So I do lots of singles, heavy enough, which again is a lot like the Chinese train. Then assistance work to fix weak points based on what I'm seeing in varying patterns. And then what I call donkey work, which is just bodybuilding bullshit, prehab type stuff. I'll do another video sometime on how I classify exercises. And that's the basic system. Now it does vary by person in terms of how many total singles they do, what assistance work they do, sometimes what donkey work they do based on what their needs are, what equipment is available, or what does or does not, fit their body. Training cycles typically run 11 to 13 weeks. I try to set that up around the meet with, I have kind of a goal progression, but I do tend to adjust it on the fly to one degree or another, and I'll describe that a little bit more. And we use the meets, obviously to compete and hit hopefully bigger numbers, and then I figure out more weak points, and we kind of do it again. And I'm not saying it's anything revolutionary. Like I said, it's how the Chinese essentially train, even if I was doing it in the late 90s. And I do kind of giggle that a lot of modern powerlifting trends have kind of moved towards what I've been doing all along, which is rather than those old school 8-5-3-1 periodization programs, are keeping a little more top-end work in. Maybe, a couple, 2 or 3 singles at 90%. I just do most of the work there. And again, I think a lot of that is informed by the fact that I'm training women, and I have a feeling that the way I coach people would probably kill a stronger male. I'd be curious to see what I'd have to change at some point, but for now, that's what I do, and that's what I'll keep doing because it works. So to drive this point home further, let me sort of briefly look at how I train, three different lifters. First is Sumi, who, as I've mentioned, I trained for 8 years. And she came into training with 20 plus years in the weight room, a humongous work capacity. She trained 6 days a week. She had squat deadlift 3 days a week, and then bench 3 days a week, and then the other work after on any given day. Michelle Freelow, who I started with about 2 years ago, is older. She's 54, does not have that background in training, had a back injury. I obviously had to train her very differently. 4 days a week, 2 squat deadlift days, 2 bench days. And then finally, I also trained Sumi's daughter, Shyla, and have for about 2 years. And she's a teenager. She's got life and school. So she trains 3 days a week, and she's got a squat deadlift lower body day and a bench upper body day during the week. And then she does all 3 on Saturday. They also do different numbers of repetitions, singles and volumes based on where they are in their training. So let me look at each a little bit more specifically. I coach Sumi in the gym every day for roughly 8 years. I know her as an athlete because I've watched her, I've trained her for so long. Every workout, every rep, every set, every day, I'm there. And with her, I have a plan, right? I have a 13-week or 11-week plan going into the meet. I know kind of what I want to see progression-wise. I know how she progresses at this point. I've joked that her training is basically a math problem, and that's not, or was. She has since retired from the sport in December for her own reasons, although she will have a book coming out about mental toughness training shortly. Get ready. I had a plan. I knew what numbers I generally wanted her to hit, what percentages, and I had that all written down, but I could possibly change that on the day. If she looked like it was a little bit heavier, she was tired, it wasn't looking the way I wanted it, I might reduce things a little bit. If she looked stronger, and I base that on bar speed based on what I'd seen, I might let her take a heavier rep or 2 sooner than I had in the plan. It was never massively outside of what I had sketched out, but I did make changes. Now, probably where the biggest changes came is for her final 5 to 6 weeks going into the meet. On Saturdays, we did what I call the strength workout, which I found years later is what they now call the SBD. So she would squat warm-ups to 6 singles at 90% plus, bench warm-ups to 6 to 10 singles depending at 90% plus, deadlifts warm-ups to 6 singles at 90% plus, competition conditions, full commands, and the goal was usually to try to hit a training PR, usually in week 4 or 5. Which I guess I've heard called Bulgarian light. And again, don't see this contradicting what I said about how dumb the idea of Bulgarian powerlifting is. This was a handful of workouts across the cycle and a handful of repetitions. It was to peak her out after she did the traditional build-up. Now again, on any given workout, I had a plan. I knew what I kind of hoped for in terms of her progression. But on any given day, I would adjust it. If it looked bad, I might stop her. If she missed the occasional rep, which is very rare if I was doing my job right, I might let her try it again. I might drop the weight back and never finish with a perfect rep. It depended on what I was seeing, and I made judgments on how much to increase the weight on any given day, again, by what I was seeing, based on her movement speed, because I knew her bar speed and I knew what I wanted it to look like. I guess just as another example of this, this was much earlier in her career, and we'd done the strength work on a Saturday, and she'd hit a big squat PR, and her bench didn't go real well, which happened, and at her next bench workout on Tuesday, it looked phenomenal. And even though I had a plan that did not include this, I said, fuck it, let's go for a PR. And I let her work up to PR, and she hit it. Why? I made a judgment call based on what I was seeing, based on the fact that she hadn't hit one on Saturday. And God damn it, if a PR is there, I'm going to let her take it. That was a judgment call, and a big one. Now, contrast that to my other lifter, Michelle. Now, Michelle, I trained from a distance. She has come to Austin multiple times to work with me. I taught her technique in person over 6 hours, and her technique is better than all y'all's. She has come, since then she's competed. She came down for a strength workout with me so I could establish some maxes earlier in her career so I could set up her assistance movements. She generally competes here in Austin, so she comes down for her final meet prep for me. So I see her occasionally, but I do not train her regularly. And I have to take a very different approach with her because I'm not there. I get videos after the workouts of this is what it looked like, and I can make adjustments for the next week. I can't do it at the workout. And because of that, I have to be much more conservative. When I give her her strength workout, I can't explain the rules that I would use, that I might use with Sumi to adjust the workout on the day. And even if I could, as a lifter, she wouldn't be able to do it, right? And I'm not going to sit there and live stream during the workout so I can watch it. So I have to give her guidelines of if this moves well, you can go the next weight, and if this gets grindy, you stop there. And there are several workouts when she sent me the video, I'm like, yeah, if I'd been there, I would have taken her heavier. But I can't be there. And I have to use much more conservative approaches. Now, Shyla is somewhere in the middle. I do train her in person, although frequently only once a week on Saturday. She trains during the week. She's got school. Sumi will train her and take her through the big movements, and I can't be there. So I have to just write out, do this, and hope for the best. I mean, Sumi's been a trainer for 20 years. She's not like she's inexperienced. And then on Saturdays when I'm there, much more fluid approach with her. Her training is much more variable week to week to week. I'm adjusting it based on what I'm seeing. If she looks strong, fuck it, I'll let her go for a PR on that day. And if not, we'll do a little bit more volume at a slightly lighter weight. So there's 3 examples. Sumi, every day in the gym, I could adjust her training every day, and I had 8 years of experience. Shyla, who I only get to see typically once a week on Saturdays in the gym, and who I cannot be nearly as predictive with as her training, I have to do it much more flexibly. It's based on what I'm seeing. And then Michelle, who I train at a distance, much, much harder, but she has come down to see me a few times. This is a big part of why I don't do online training, like regular online training, especially for something like powerlifting. I'm a technical perfectionist, and I simply cannot teach technique at a distance. I can adjust it once I have taught it, like with Michelle, but I mean, I know a lot of these online things, and they have videos, and this is how you do a proper movement, and I watch people for 30 years in the gym, and most of their technique sucks. And that's just the realities of it. It's different for bodybuilding, which is a lot easier, but even so, proper technique is important, and I can't teach that at a distance. So I don't. I mean, hearing people try to learn Olympic lifting without a coach, I've seen the videos. It's pretty funny. So that's problem one. The other one is, as you can tell, I'm a very hands-on coach. I make adjustments very much on the day based on what I'm seeing, and I can't just write a generic program for someone and hope for the best without being able to adjust it fairly regularly. In Sumi's case, daily. In Michelle's case, weekly. And then in Shyla's case, frequently it could be on any sort of variation. And I just can't do that from a distance. I know a lot of people do, and I've had them come to me to get consultations, and they tell me about the generic-ass random bullshit monthly training they got, supposedly based on their questionnaire, and it's not any good. And I always have to step in and fix it, and I'll mention an example of that later. Mind you, even though I don't do it, bodybuilding and fat loss is a hell of a lot easier to do this sort of thing with, just because bodybuilding training by and large is stupid. and much easier compared to high performance level training. I can just give someone a 12-week cycle and give them a couple rules and fucking let them go. Fat loss is super easy in the big picture. Like, I know a lot of online coaches will do like, all right, this week we're going to replace this protein with that protein and this and all this other bullshit. And that's just busy work to justify their cost. I'll just say, just do this for 12 weeks and then we can worry about it. But I still don't do it because it's not necessary. I don't need to give people a different workout every month, so they have to pay me. I just draw it up and go do this for 12 weeks and then reset the weights, and then we'll talk. Like, the biggest thing I do for bodybuilding stuff is just figuring out movements based on individual levers and biomechanics that might be better or worse. But you even see that. You get generic-ass programs written up, just do the big movements by someone who's built for the big movements and gives them to someone tall, and then they come to me and I got to fix that shit. Regardless, bodybuilding training, fat loss is but easy to program in the longer term. I can't do it for something like powerlifting, or not the way I coach. Again, I know people do it. I know people do it well. The way I do things, I'm not one of them. Just as an example to kind of drive this home and sum up this whole previous section, the two female powerlifters I coached way back in the day, one of them decided she wanted to do a bodybuilding show. And as it turned out, that bodybuilding show was 2 weeks before the powerlifting competition they were both going to do. So in a fit of insanity, I told her I was going to prep her for both at the same time. And it's both one of the craziest, one of the most difficult, and actually one of the most impressive things I've ever done, because it worked. Not only did I get her into contest shape, by which I mean she looked better than Mike Israetel has ever looked on stage, she was able to enter her powerlifting meet at a lower weight class and hit PRs. Now, the amount of adjustments I was making to her training was immense, because on any given day, she was coming in for her predominantly powerlifting training, which again, assistance work and bodybuilding stuff, having done cardio that morning, being in the depths of hell dieting. And I would make adjustments in terms of the weights, the reps, the volumes, every workout. If we were doing the bodybuilding stuff and I saw she was cooked after one set when I had 4 planned, fuck it, she was done. Trying to balance out those demands of heavy powerlifting, assistance work, and the bodybuilding stuff, along with the diet and the cardio, was intense. But because I'm either awesome or just lucky, I got her there. I don't think I'd want to have to do it again. So let me finish by talking about, what I write in my books, and I think at this point I've written 14 or some ungodly number like that, versus what I do in my online consultation. Available now, bodyrecomposition.com. So I've written, again, a bunch of books, and when I write those, I have to keep them much more conservative in the information that I give. In the sense of, I don't know who the reader is beyond a certain, I don't know if you're a 22-year-old male, a postmenopausal female. I don't know who my readership is. I don't know what your background is beyond a certain point. I have to give conservative recommendations for a safety standpoint, but there are things that, this will sound terrible, and this sounds like I'm even more of an elitist prick than everyone already thinks I am, but it's true. I have to predict where people are going to fuck it up. And I've gotten pretty good at it. The number of times I've written don't do X and gotten an email said should I do X is appalling. Any of you who've had the misfortune of reading my books, who wonder why I repeat the same warning over and over and over again, is because if I don't say it 6 times, people won't get it. It's the same thing I do in these videos, because someone will listen to this and completely fucking mishear what I said, despite the fact that I repeated it a goddamn dozen times. I've learned the hard way that I have to guess, how are people going to fuck this up? Okay, here's an example of how people fucked it up. Back in the 1990s, Bill Phillips, who started Muscle Media 2000, wrote a book called Body for Life. One of the better books, bringing bodybuilding ideas into the general public. He was really one of the first in terms of heavy resistance training, protein, whatever. Well, he included the cheat day, and he wrote in the book, you can eat anything you want for 24 hours. And there were stories of people who took that literally. They would wake up at 12:01 a.m. and put as much shit down the pie hole as they could till 11:59 p.m. He said one day, he said 24 hours. And then they wondered why the diet didn't work. That's why go read Flexible Dieting. Go read what I've talked about with refeeds, a term I no longer use for reasons I'll explain later. I'm very careful to say, don't do that, because somebody will. Somebody will. If I don't say don't do it, somebody will do it, and then I'll get a pissy email, your diet sucks, and I don't need that shit in my life. So when I write my books, the point of this all being that I have to be very conservative. Because again, I don't know what the person is, I don't know the specifics. Now, contrast that to my consultations. Available now, bodyrecomposition.com, which are a one-on-one thing. First, people get a questionnaire, so I can get a baseline of what they're looking to do and who they are. But usually, when I'll shut up about my own nonsense, the first 30 to 45 minutes of that consult is me asking them questions to try to get a better feel for who they are as a person. They've got body fat goals. Where did this number come from? Where are the estimates coming from? What are your goals? So I can give them some reality checks. Previous dieting history. What's worked? What hasn't worked? What does your training look like? What does your fucking life look like? Which is something that's often forgotten. The advice I might give a 22-year-old obsessed physique athlete who does nothing but, and the advice I might give a 35-year-old woman with a husband and 2 kids and a job will not be the same. Something else that's often forgotten. Did a consult with a guy a couple weeks ago, and he said, yeah, after I went through the online dumb shits and got generic bullshit every month, he worked with a bodybuilder who gave him, you must eat 6 meals a day and mini meals and this and an hour or 2 of training 6 days a week. And the guy's got a job and a life and he can't do it because to that bodybuilder, that's how you do it because that's what works for him. I don't work that way because A, it's not necessary unless you're at the highest level, right? Like, so I recently advised a guy in my group, Larry Shipe Jr., a bodybuilder, and I helped him get ready for his first show, which was a dry run, and then his next show 4 weeks later, and he got his natural pro card. Fuck you, Mike, you'll never get a pro card, and my most recent guy I worked with got his. And I bet you're pissed about Charlie. Regardless, what I would give him as advice, this elite bodybuilder, what advice I might give Sumi, who's training at the highest level of powerlifting, what might I give a 35-year-old who doesn't have that kind of time or obsession or compulsiveness? Completely different advice. Because in consultation, I can figure out who they are and what sort of approach, training or otherwise, might work best. Here's an example. Most people have a very generic approach to training. And yes, I've written something called the generic bulking program, which is aimed at generally intermediate trainees in a specific context, something that often gets missed, which is probably on me for not making it clearer. And that's great. It's 4 days per week, upper, lower, fantastic. It's not for everybody. Again, a guy I consulted, I think the same guy who'd seen the bodybuilder, we talked about his training, and he couldn't do that much training a week. Family, job, obligations, all of that. And we were talking about it, and he's getting back into training, and initially I set up a very standard 3-day-a-week, full body, what I would do with the average beginner, with 2 workouts during the week and 1 on the weekend, and that's what I would typically do. And then towards the end of the conversation, he pointed out, yeah, actually, weekends are better for me, scheduling-wise, because I've got more time. And I said, all right, forget what I just told you about 3 days a week, full body. I usually do that to keep people from fucking up and doing too much volume too early, but he actually came from powerlifting. He knew better. I said, look, we're throwing that out. You're going to train Saturday, Sunday, upper, lower, and then 1 short full body during the week, which is a split that doesn't get enough love, separate video. That also integrated with what I was giving him in terms of dietary advice, which was an alternate day fasting, intermittent caloric restriction. On the weekends, he wanted to have more time to train. He didn't want to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the gym. And I said, well, this is once a week. That approach, which is not what I would necessarily give anybody else, fit his life. How the fuck do I put that in a book? How can I explain the series of questions that I'm going to ask, all of which are going to branch into different questions, all of which are going to lead me to different pieces of data that I'm going to put together on the fly to come up with a program for that individual? How do I write that down? I can't. I can't. I can also make assumptions, again, I have to predict in my books how people are going to fuck it up. And I have to get a feel for the person when I'm doing a consultation. Again, this sounds terrible, but it's not. I have to figure out, okay, some people need rigid plans and specific numbers. Some people are pretty good and flexible about it. Depends on where they are, their previous background. I have to assume kind of what I'm going to tell them. Now, don't mishear this. I'm not saying I'm lying to them. I'm not saying I'm lying in my books. I'm saying that I'm giving qualitatively different versions of the same advice based on the specifics. I can do that in person, and even among two different people, I may give slightly different versions of the same advice based on what's right for them. But I can't put any of that shit in my books. So to avoid fucking people up, I have to be much more conservative. I have to keep it much simpler. And that's the difference between what I can write in an article on my website, in one of my overwritten books, and what I do when I consult with people. Let me finish up. So I guess I should actually address what I was supposedly going to talk about, which is like, what does this have to do with the injury issue? And the answer is that a lot of training programs, as done under a coached situation, can be very, very different in their injury risk than when they're written about and someone applies them without understanding them, right? I mentioned that, the Norwegian system and high volume and Shaco and Smolov, those are very different systems when they're being coached, where the coach can step in and prevent the athlete from getting fucked up when something goes wrong, right? As someone in my group pointed out after my last video, back in the 2000s when Smolov, especially, and Shaco came out and everyone jumped on that bandwagon, there were a lot of abandoned logs because people jumped into that without understanding it, without realizing that Shaco had a bunch of earlier build-up systems. They jumped into the advanced thing because everyone online is more as advanced as 10 million people. Smolov truly broke people, truly. But without a coach there, without Louis there, and his system broke people anyway because of the constant maxing. But Charlie Francis, he had to keep his athletes safe. And if he saw technique falling apart, he stopped them. Abajev didn't care, honestly. The Chinese, I'm quite sure, the coach is making adjustments. If he sees something going that's maybe going to hurt the athlete, I guarantee you he stops them. Because again, my purely anecdotal experience, being injured is not good for gains. With Sumi, as much as I wanted to see certain numbers, if I saw something going on that I thought was going to get her hurt, she would stop. Or I would adjust the workout. Whereas if I write this shit down, and you just go, I'm going to do this exact workout, you're going to get fucked up. With Michelle, I have to be much more conservative for exactly that reason, because I'm not there. In my books, I have to be that much more careful so I don't give peaceful advice that's going to fuck them up. Whereas in a consult, I can give them individual advice to fuck them up. It's a joke, hopefully. So that's kind of my point. When well-meaning people write about their system, they often forget that they're not there to observe them. Maybe they understand it because they're the ones doing it or they're the ones coaching it. But that doesn't mean that writing it down for someone and giving it to them without coaching and without the ability to explain these nuances and these heuristics will do them any good. And when you're looking at shit like high frequency training in the weight room or whatever, yeah, might I use that under, well, no, I wouldn't because it's dumb. But there were times when I had Sumi doing 2-a-days during certain blocks of her training where she would, do a little bit of extra volume later in the day. But I was watching every day. And if I saw that it was tiring her out, I stopped her. And I can't put that in an article. And even if I could put it in an article, people won't fucking listen. If I say, yeah, do 2-a-day training for a month and stop, the average person is going to get to 4 weeks, go, I feel good and keep going, and blow up and burn out and get injured and then send me a pissy email about how my training advice sucks. And I don't need that shit in my life. It's a good thing I'm not bitter, huh? So that's kind of where I was getting at in terms of the injuries. Once again, for certain approaches to training, whether it's high volume running, cycling, lifting, If a coach is there, they might be able to get away with it because they can stop the individual based on their experience before the athlete gets fucked up. And if they're not there, they shouldn't be giving that fucking advice because realistically, it is going to fuck them up. See you next time.